go now, here we go now. Whoa, whoa, let's talk with Lakshmee. Yeah. Bring the topics, let we chat now.
Good evening, and welcome to Let's Talk with Lakshmee, a show about us, our people, our community, our culture, our experiences. Viewers, our Indian ancestors migrated over 165 years ago to the West Indies. Our current generation knows very little about where we came from. So, we ask ourselves these questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going? In order to answer these questions, we really must know where our ancestry comes from. Today, in the studio, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Ramesh Ramcharran. Ramesh is a professional accountant. He also has an MBA graduate from the UK, and he currently works at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. Today, he's here to share with us his documentary of our ancestry and his trip to India. Ramesh, welcome to Let's Talk with Lakshmee.
Well, thanks, Lakshmi. And first, I must say, I'm happy to be given this opportunity to share some of my experience going back to our ancestral village back in India. I work as the campus management auditor at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. In addition to that, I'm a management consultant, and I have a passion for my journey to roots, visiting India and my ancestral village on at least 4 occasions.
It's a very, very interesting topic, and it's something that a lot of our viewers today will want to know. Exactly where do we come from? But before we start on that, Ramesh, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where in Trinidad are you from?
I was born in Tacarigua, which is North Trinidad. For people who are familiar with Trinidad, it's about 5 minutes drive from the airport.
Okay.
I was born in Tacarigua. My grandparents came from India. Let me go into the history a bit. My grandparents came from India on the SS Indus in 1905, and they went to Jamaica. They stayed in Jamaica for 10 years. They were assigned to the Nuri estate at Anota Bay, which is on the north coast of India. That estate they had a lot of banana plantation and sugar plantation.
Sugar plantations, okay.
After that, they migrated to Trinidad, and my grandparents stayed in Trinidad in Tacarigua. Then my father was born there, and I was born in Tacarigua in North Trinidad.
Okay. Now tell me a little bit about your academic pursuit.
My academic pursuit, well, I studied the ACCA exam, which is from the UK. It's like the CPA that you have here.
Okay.
My profession, I did work in both accountancy and auditing. Now I have moved a step further more into management consultancy, which I enjoy a lot more because it's challenging and it's dealing a lot with human behavior in a corporate world. So I enjoy that a lot more than the numbers, dealing with books and figures.
Okay. So Ramesh, tell me, how does a professional accountant go from dealing with numbers to wanting to go back to India and finding their roots? Now, would you say this is something you always wanted to do, or did you come across something in your life, in your work, that made you make this decision to go back to India?
Okay, as I mentioned earlier on, my grandparents came from India in 1905, and I happen to know my grandmother. I spent about 10 years of my early life with her, and she told us a lot of stories, gave us a lot of history on the background, on the family in India. She also told us that we have lots of relatives in India, and I grew up with that passion that one day I have to make that trip to my ancestral village in India. I made the first trip in 1999.
Okay.
And after that, I have been there several times, and I really enjoy going back to the village in India. It's really fascinating, and it's very difficult to really explain in words. You know, as this is some things in life, you have to experience. It's difficult to explain in words the feelings, the emotions, and how you are treated when you go back to these places. And I should say that the people there are very poor, and but they treat you very well.
So now, growing up as a child, and your grandmother would tell you these stories, she told you what village you were from?
Of course, she gave us the address.
She gave you the address, okay.
Yes, and I'll call it the address. It's the village name is Karauni Gaon, which is situated in the Kapradi region in North India. It's in the district of Faizabad, and it is in Uttar Pradesh. As you will know, most of our ancestors that came to the West Indies came from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Some came from Assam, some from South India, Madras and those areas, but the majority came from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar.
Okay. Now, you're actually quite fortunate that your grandmother was able to tell you the address of where her parents came from in India.
Where she came from,
Where she came. She was born there.
She was born in India.
Okay.
Both my grandparents on my father's side, my Aja and Aji, were born in India, and both migrated to Jamaica and then came to Trinidad. Now also, my father visited our ancestral home in 1972. So he was the first one from Trinidad who, in our family, who was able to make that trip. But unfortunately, he could not stay too long. He spent like just under 1 day. And because he was on a tour and he had to divert from the tour and visit his
the village.
uncles and so on. Yeah. And you know, all these things just grew with me, and it made the passion to visit these places a lot stronger, because when he came back, he told us a lot of stories that were very fascinating.
Tell me a story. Tell me a story that either grandma told you or that your dad told you.
Okay, she used to talk about a lot of landmarks
Okay.
in the village. There was a big pond that she said not far away from where they live. Opposite the house, there was the well that they got the water from. And she described the village, very small houses, but everybody lived like family. It was a very close-knit community. The village, the main crops that were grown, the main industry, was agriculture, but
Same like in Guyana and Trinidad.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
In addition to agriculture, they did pottery. A lot of people did the pottery, and they sold the pottery at the various markets. And the nearest town that you can find on a map of Uttar Pradesh or on Google is a town called Hyderganj.
Okay.
And that was the town for them in those days. It's about, when I visited in December last year, it's about, I would say, about 2 miles from where they live. So when they're going to town to get supplies and so on, that's where they journey to.
Ramesh, in 1999, when you first went back to India, what was the welcome like from your family?
Okay, let me give you a little history.
Okay.
In 1999, we traveled from Ghaziabad, which is just on the outskirts of Delhi, to Lucknow, where my cousin, whose name was Ram Sundar, or is Ram Sundar, I told him to come at the Arif Castle Hotel and meet media. We traveled by train, and 4 of us made the journey, myself, my wife, my mother, and my daughter. And incidentally, the 4 of us are in the US right now.
Okay.
And he met us at the Arif Castle Hotel, and that meeting was very, very emotional. It was tears on both sides, and I don't want to go too much into the emotions part. But after meeting us, he said that it was unsafe for us to visit the home of my grandparents. And I asked him why.
Why?
Right. Why are you telling us it's unsafe? Because we planned this journey. It was something as a lifetime desire for us to visit the home of my grandparents. And you are telling me now that it's unsafe. But of course, all this conversation was taking place in Bhojpuri. He can't speak a word in English. So after discussing and so on, I tell him, I say, I don't want to hear anything. He said there's a lot of daku, thief. I said, I don't want to hear anything. I am going. And the next day we hired a van, and with him, we made our journey. When I reached there, within 2 or 3 minutes, the entire village came to see us, because it was the first time in their history and in their imagination that someone would have, after almost 100 years, you know, the generation, we were the second generation, would be returning back to the village. It was something very unbelievable to them. And I remember many of the older people, they came and they threw themselves at our feet, and they cry on our shoulders and so on. But before I go into that, let me talk about the welcoming ceremony. They put us to sit, and they wash our feet with water, and they give us a massage. And as people who are familiar with the Ramayana and so on, this is how they greeted people in the past. And they give us that ceremonial welcome. And after they were telling us that, you know, just like in Trinidad, Guyana, and Jamaica, and maybe Suriname, where we hear the stories about our ancestors who came from India via the various ships and so on, and we would hear stories. In India, I must say, and I want listeners to take note of this, contrary to what people would see, those stories are handed down in the villages also. And many of them were telling me that their family, their relatives also left the same time my grandfather left in 1905. And why is it that no one ever came back to look for any of the relatives in those villages? They never sent a letter, or there were no means of correspondence between the people who left those villages and their relatives in India.
What was your findings for that?
Well, I explained to them the difficulty, because the children or the kids now would know about internet and email and SMS and whatever. In those days, it was a letter you had to write, and it had to go by surface mail. And a lot of our ancestors who came to these parts could not read or write. In fact, I'm jumping a bit. When you go to Calcutta and look at the documents, a lot of them did not sign. They put their thumbprint on those documents, signifying their agreement to be indentured and travel to the West Indies. So to write a letter back home was difficult. And also, as time went along, people hardly spoke about their past. And this is one of the reasons why we have lost that connection back with our ancestors in India. But I would tell you that, and the listeners out there, that a lot of stories are handed down in those villages, and the people would like to know about their relatives who migrated to the West Indies.